If you're a bobwhite quail, every living, breathing moment of your life is dictated by the threat of predation. Some of those predators we can do something about. Others, like raptors, hawks, we really can't do anything about, except try to provide a good defense. And so we're going to talk a little bit about the defensive strategy of bobwhites and how they cope with predators and how quail houses. Now, when I say quail houses, I'm talking about something that's about the size of a Volkswagen Beetle or the cab of your pickup. Some kind of shrub. Let's look a little bit about the blueprint of what a good quail house should be. It ought to be dense from above, open at ground level. Dense from above means I'm protected from the hawks. They can't see me or they can't get to me as well. Open at ground level, I can be scouting for mammalian predators, bobcats, coyotes, bird dogs. So that's the kind of blueprint that we like to see. Now there's a number of plants here on the Rolling Plains Quail Research Ranch that satisfy these blueprints. Now we've got about 25 species of woody plants here, and some people might say, oh my gosh. We say, oh thank you, because we're proud of most of the woody plants that we have. And we'll talk about 5 or 6 of those that are especially important to us. The species may vary depending on where you're at, but the anatomy of a quail house will be the same. Dense above, open at ground level, about the size of a Volkswagen Beetle at least, and we ought to be able to throw a softball in the air from one quail house to the next. So it gives you an idea about what the spacing of those plants should be. We have another webisode called Softball Habitat Evaluation Technique. You can look at that for more information on how to judge the density of those shrubs and their importance to quail. Quail use these quail houses especially from about 10 o'clock in the morning, mid-morning through late afternoon. Sometimes we refer to them as loafing coverts, with the idea that quail are just taking it easy here. If you're a quail, you don't really ever take it easy. So I don't know if loafing is a good word, but probably 6 to 7 hours a day under the protection of these types of shrubs. They've gone out early morning, they've fed, they've filled their crop with seeds and insects. Now they retreat to the relatively secure situation here. So it's one way that a quail helps minimize the threat of predation. Now there are several different sumacs that occur in West Texas. A lot of you will have more of the skunk bush sumac. Generally doesn't get this large. Little leaf sumac is a wonderful quail house, produces a good seed also for quail, and the leaves are basically compound leaves. So they're fairly unique. They'll look, again, the cover, the blueprint has been met, dense above, open at ground level. This is one of our desirable ones, little leaf sumac. We have several species of catclaws that make good quail houses. Right now we're at a catclaw acacia. There's also a catclaw mimosa. We'll discuss that one in a second. The catclaw acacia can assume some pretty large dimensions. You can see this one's the size of a super cab pickup. So it has those requirements that we like to see. It's a good seed producer, produces a fairly large seed, so quail will like that too. It does have the cat claws, so if you walk through it, they're going to grab you. But if it's a more woody plant, more of a small tree, it'll be the catclaw acacia. One of the things that we found in a study out here where we looked at how quail respond to hawk predation is that about 38% of the time the quail, the radio-collared quail, actually went underground to get away from a hawk. And these catclaw acacias, these bigger ones, nearly all of them have got burrows, tunnels, rat tunnels down below the vegetation here. And those quail were using these as storm shelters. When that hawk gets after them, they'll come to one of these, they'll go underground about 40% of the time. So again, important association between good shrub cover and the ability for a quail to minimize the threat from raptors. This is the second of our catclaws that we have that make good quail houses. This one is called Catclaw mimosa. It is a very prickly plant. It's got more claws on it than the catclaw acacia. And some people refer to it as wait a minute bush. If you ever go charging through one of these, you'll see why, because it'll hold you up. It's got numerous catclaws. It's a smaller leaf than what the catclaw acacia has. Normally makes a smaller plant. If we look at the leaf of this one versus the catclaw acacia, it's a much more finely dissected leaf, more of a smaller compound leaf than what the acacia is. So if you ever see the two side by side, they're fairly easy to distinguish. You're going to find these growing on gravelly ridges. Makes a great screening cover for quail. They get under these when they're foraging and so forth, and again, it provides them a measure of hawk protection. So this was Catclaw mimosa. One of the other added benefits of the catclaws is they're pretty resistant to most herbicides. We did a study here on the Rolling Plains Quail Research Ranch where we looked at some commonly applied prickly pear herbicides, things like Tordon, things like Surmount, and some of the other herbicides like that. And we were curious, what is their effect on our important woody plant species? Now basically all of them kill the hackberries, which is a loss, but the catclaw mimosas and the catclaw acacias seem to be fairly resilient. So if you've got those in your plant arsenal out here, you've got more. It's like having more stocks in your portfolio. Some of them may be impacted by drought or by herbicides, but the catclaws are probably going to be there with you. One of the more common quail houses we have across the western rolling plains is Wolfberry. Now this one doesn't look very impressive right now. Here it is in mid-August and it looks dead. It's not dead, but about 2 weeks ago, all the wolfberries dropped their leaves. First time it gets hot and dry during the summer, they drop their leaves. When we get some rains in September, they'll come back. They'll have a nice little translucent orange fruit on them, and quail will really like them. So again, dense above, open at ground level, that's what we're looking for. Where I was raised in southwestern Oklahoma, Loke Bush, often called bluethorn or chaparral by the locals, was probably the best quail house that we have for the bobwhites and blue quail we had there. Again, Loke Bush is pretty easy to distinguish by its color. It'll have these long thorns. Really nothing eats it. It's pretty resistant to herbicides. So again, it makes a good quail house. It's one of the top 2 quail houses across most of the rolling plains of Texas. Loke Bush, L-O-T-E-B-U-S-H. Another great quail house occurs especially in the southern half of the rolling plains and then throughout the Edwards Plateau and most of West Texas. Is commonly called Alger Eita. The correct name is Agarito, but you can see it looks like a holly type leaf, so it's very easy to distinguish. It's an evergreen, produces a nice red fruit on there back earlier in the summer. People make jelly out of those, so they're tasty from that standpoint. But again, dense above, open to ground level, makes a great quail house. We've got a lot of prickly pear here at the Rolling Plains Quail Research Ranch of different kinds. We have the low growing pear, which can be very important to us for nesting cover. And then we have some of these motts or clumps of taller growing pear. We call it South Texas prickly pear. If you've ever been in South Texas, you see a lot of this. Great quail house for quail, great storm shelter for quail. When those hawks get after them, they'll oftentimes, it's as if they know where every one of these clumps of big prickly pear are. So they're very valuable wildlife habitat for quail here for us in the southern rolling plains. Also, their fruits are just beginning to ripen. You'll sometimes see bobwhites that have purple faces later on in the summer. That's because they've been attacking the fruits of those prickly pear, getting the seeds out of them, and then also the quail's enemies, the coyotes and the raccoons, especially coyotes. This was the #2 food item across a 3-year study here on the Quail Research Ranch was prickly pear fruits. For most of you in the northern half of the rolling plains or the eastern part of the Texas Panhandle, when you think of quail house, when your bird dog thinks of quail house, where are they going to look for a covey of quail? They're looking under a sand plum thicket, a wild plum. And wild plum is the Cadillac of quail houses, if you will. It can get anywhere from fairly small, like this particular one is, but it might be 3 or 4 acres in size. And as such, those are real key habitats where you have those. Quail love them. That's where your deer oftentimes will bed down. Produces that good fruit that we love to make wild plum jelly out of. Attracts grasshoppers, and so it offers quail quite a bit. Follows our basic blueprint, dense above, open at ground level. And let me take this opportunity to say that quail are not plant taxonomists. We've talked about 6 or 7 species of brush here. You may not have any of them on your property. Quail don't know to look for certain leaf structure. They're looking for growth form. So they don't care if it's one of the 6 species we've talked about today, as long as it satisfies that basic blueprint, dense above, open at ground level, about the size of your pickup truck. Quail will probably use that as a quail house. One of the great thickets for quail, in other words, a quail condo, if you will, is chitum, Bumelia. It has thorns on it. It grows in these pretty thick mottes like this. It occurs over a lot of the rolling plains, especially on the sandier soils. Produces a real nice black fruit about mid-October that the quail like. Basically every kind of wildlife eats them, but it's this thicket like this. And one thing chitum has over the other quail houses we've talked about is some height. And what that means is a taller covert is more cool during the summer than a lower growing covert. So the ability to have both. Let quail take advantage of that little bit of thermal relief on these 105-degree days in this chitum during the summer, and then get into that Loke Bush or something that's closer at ground level for those cold January blue northers come through and provide, and think about the thermal needs of quail as you think about what that habitat should look like. Now you might be thinking, well, gee, that's great. You've got all that shrub diversity, but all I have are mesquites. We're on an old field site right now. It's probably planted 30 years ago to cotton, and now all it has on it, brush-wise, is regrowth mesquite. This type of brush isn't very good quail house. I'm going to show you through a process that we call half cutting, how we can change the structure of that to make it more like that ideal blueprint that we want for quail. So as we move up to this one was half cut 2 years ago. And when I say half cut, we just take a multiple stem tree, cut about halfway through those branches, break them down. We haven't killed that mesquite. We've just made it grow downward like this. So we're trying to create that dense above, open at ground level situation. Now we wouldn't want just one of these per 100 acres. We want a bunch of these, because the last thing you want to do is create a situation where a hawk discovers there's a covey of quail under here and that covey of quail has nowhere to go. So you want to have multiple places on that landscape. I recommend at least 10 of these over the size of a football field to be able to kind of confuse your predators. And again, this is a last resort. You'd rather be able to use that Loke Bush, that little leaf sumac, but if you don't have those and all you have is regrowth mesquite, half cutting is one option. And we have another webisode called Half Cutting Mesquite. You can look at that and discover if that works for you.